But who is my neighbor? That's the next question that's asked. That's what Jesus teaches us through this parable. Look at verse 29. Who is my neighbor? But he, that's the Jewish lawyer, after Jesus said, do this and live, but he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? If you know the gospel, that should be kind of a red flag. You go, whoop! And he, desiring to justify himself. What? And he, desiring through his works, through his obedience, through saying, now Jesus, make sure you tell me what you're saying specifically so that I can obey in the specific way so that I will be declared righteous through what I have done. So that I can declare myself righteous. And we know only through the gospel of Jesus are any of us declared righteous by God. So this is a negative. He, desiring to justify himself, asks, and who is my neighbor? You say, I got to do this and live? Okay, I got the God part down. That's what he's thinking, it seems. But who's my neighbor? Shorten the list. Tell me specifically what I must do. And Jesus replied, the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. This is a very famous road from Jerusalem to Jericho. I think it's about 20 kilometers, and it was called the Way of Blood, because it was a very tight and winding path from Jerusalem to Jericho with jagged rocks and many places that robbers could hide out and ambush you on the way. So this parable he's telling would resonate with this Jewish lawyer here because everyone knows the path from Jerusalem to Jericho. So he's saying something very similar to the man, something that had probably happened thousands of times to people on this dangerous road. In verse 31, he says, now by chance, a priest was going down that road. This is a Jewish priest. A priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. The person in this story is a Jew. It's a man walking from Jerusalem to Jericho, two Jewish cities. Is likely a Jew, and someone who's a priest and someone who's a Levite is also a Jew. So it's their kinsman according to their physical ancestry. It's a kinsman walking right by them and looking at him in need. And we don't know. Jesus doesn't give us why they passed by, but they did. Maybe they didn't want to take time to do it. There were conditions that this man in need did not meet. Being half dead, if they touched him, they would be ceremonially unclean and wouldn't be able to go into the temple for a week. We don't know. Jesus doesn't give us those details. But for whatever reason, these specific guys, who are this guy's brother, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, someone from northern part of Israel, from Samaria, who were half-breeds, as the Jews called them. They were like half Jews, but then they started marrying and having children with pagans, with people who did not worship Yahweh, God, the Lord, the God of the Bible. So the Jews hated the Samaritans. These are people who sold out and didn't keep the Jewish bloodline pure. They disobeyed the word of God by going and marrying foreign people. And God said, don't do that because you're going to be led astray to worship foreign gods. If you intermarry with other people who worship other gods, you'll be unequally yoked. Don't do that. And they did that. And now they're called Samaritans. And the Jews hated them. They despised them. So the fact that Jesus puts a Samaritan should cause us to take notice. As he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. That's the most frequently used word describing Jesus' emotions while he's on the earth. In all the gospel accounts, that Jesus, the writers would say, had compassion. That's the most frequent word that we have to describe Jesus' posture of his emotions. So this Samaritan in the parable had compassion on the guy. And he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii, not a small amount of money, and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." End of the story. And Jesus looks at the lawyer. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And the lawyer said, verse 37, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." Surface level. Who's my neighbor? That's what the guy asks. What's Jesus' answer seem to be? Anyone and everyone. Especially when it comes to loving our neighbors and loving and helping people, it's anyone in need. The word neighbor, the literal meaning of that word is just the one near. Whoever is in your path, whoever you have the power to help. Who is my neighbor? Even an enemy. A Samaritan was made an enemy by the Jews. The Jews hated the Samaritans more than the Samaritans hated the Jews. Samaritans didn't like the Jews, mostly because the Jews hated the Samaritans. You tend to not like people who really hate you. It's kind of like in the Holocaust, the Jews that lived in those areas in Europe, they didn't hate the Germans. They didn't hate Nazis. They didn't hate that party until it got to the point that the Nazis really hated the Jews. And then, in turn, they had animosity towards the Nazis. But it wasn't like the Jewish people who lived in that area were just like, golly, I hate Germans. I hate the Nazi party. Well, they did eventually because the Nazis hated them. In the same way, the Samaritans, they didn't like the Jews either, but it was because the Jews and their self-righteousness hated and despised the Samaritans. And when Jesus says a Samaritan was walking and there's a Jew bloodied and beaten up on the side of the road, that's what it looks like to love your neighbor. We should be learning it doesn't matter who the person is. It doesn't matter if they deserve it. It doesn't matter if the only thing I owe them through what they've done against me, if I only really truly owe them death. Nope. Love, mercy, compassion. Your neighbor is anyone and everyone, especially an enemy. Especially an enemy. It's not just an exception. It's like, I guess we should. Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Your neighbor is anyone that you have power to help. Anyone in your path.